Welcome to the Playbook presented by the Leaders Lab. I'm Ken Eslick, and if you're a leader or founder who wants to hire top talent, scale your business, and sell for more, you're in the right place. Each week, Annika Kwacha and I bring you practical, actionable advice that you can put to work immediately to make an impact in your business today. And now, here's this week's episode. Welcome back to the Playbook. I'm your host, Ken Eslick, and I want to start today's show on a personal note. We had a previous podcast called the Leaders Lab Podcast. We interviewed about 150 people and had some amazing guests, but no one is etched in my memory more than Jerry Colonna. And I think the reason why is his willingness to be vulnerable, and it made a profound impact on me. And it's exactly why I felt it was essential to bring him back to the Playbook. Jerry's story is the ultimate example of the crucible moment. Before he was known as a CEO whisperer, Jerry was a titan of New York's Silicon Alley. He was the co-founder of Flatiron Partners. He was one of the most successful venture capitalists of the dot-com era, and he launched companies that defined the early internet. On paper, Jerry was on top of the world, but behind the scenes, he was crumbling. Following the tragedy of 9/11, he faced a massive wake-up call. He battled deep depression and suicidal ideations despite his massive success. He realized that the toxicity of endless movement was destroying him. So Jerry walked away from finance and he embarked on the path of radical self-inquiry. He eventually co-founded Reboot.io to help other leaders from falling into the same trap. He is the author of the best-selling book, Reboot, and his latest release, Reunion. Please join me in welcoming Jerry Colonna to the Playbook, coming up next. Hey, Jerry, good to see you.
It's good to see you again, Ken. How are you?
Good, and I so appreciate you being on the show. This is a new podcast for us. You were on my last podcast. I'm not saying this just because you're here right now. I'm saying it because of your story and your vulnerability, but I interviewed about 150 people on that show, and your episode just always plays in my mind. It really does. And I'd love to go back to your own crucible moment and career and life in the 80s and 90s, if you wouldn't mind starting there.
First of all, it's nice to see you again. And it's also nice to know that I've been living in your head. So I'll send you a bill
Good.
for that.
Rent-free.
Exactly. What is it specifically that you'd find helpful to circle back to?
I know it wasn't your first gig, but as you got into finance and you co-founded Flatiron, where I want to get to is what was happening for you when seemingly everything you had worked for in terms of career and success was happening, but it wasn't happening for you internally.
I think we need to have a little context. I'll be 62 on Sunday when I was 38 years old. I was a co-founder at an early stage venture capital firm called Flatiron Partners, named after the neighborhood, the building in Manhattan. And at 38, a depression that had been building for a number of years had overtaken me. And suicidal ideation had returned. I thankfully chose not to give into those feelings, but instead chose to go on with my life in a different way. So how did we get there? Let me roll back the clock and we'll do a little teleportation, if you will. I grew up with some pretty intense experiences. And I know you've read my book, so you know a bit about those. I had a mother who was mentally ill, a father who was alcoholic. I grew up with an enormous amount of violence in the household. I grew up in Brooklyn, of which I'm very proud. I spent most of my childhood navigating the spaces by being the best boy I could be and being a good boy and stuffing down a lot of really challenging feelings. That system collapsed when I was 18. and a depression, which at that point had been building for about a year, boiled over in my first semester in college. And I ended that first semester with an actual suicide attempt. I ended up in a psychiatric hospital for about 2.5, 3 months. And really, for the first time in my life, began looking at the question of who was I and what the hell had happened to me. I did well in recovery, so much so that I went back to school the following semester. And while I had unpacked a new way of looking at my life, it was kind of Band-Aid. And I spent 4 or 5 years in therapy and 4 or 5 years kind of being the good boy again. I was back in college. I started to develop a career. I became a journalist. I became very successful. I got married. I had first one kid, then a second kid, then a third kid. And by the time I was in my 30s, the whole life that I had constructed for myself, which included becoming a very successful venture capitalist, outwardly was very, very successful. But inwardly, I was back to this place where the depression was kind of like this creeping experience. And the issue, the way I would describe it is that the more successful I became, the worse I began to feel.
You said a couple of times being a good boy. Was that doing things for other people generally instead of for yourself? I mean, you're trying to live up, I'm guessing, at first to your parents' expectations and then eventually to societal expectations. What did being a good boy mean?
I think that as a child, it meant not being a burden,
Yeah.
not upsetting anyone. In Reboot, my first book, I talk about this refrain that was just so much a part of my childhood, my siblings and I, which was picture my father sitting at a kitchen table saying over and over again, don't upset your mother. Don't upset your mother. So for me, it wasn't so much living up to expectations placed upon me, because I don't think there were very many expectations placed upon me. It was don't upset your mother. Don't upset anything. Later, as I became an adult, there was more of that performative nature where the affirmation that I sought from the world became a sustenance for me. It became a substitute for my own sense of self-worth. And the way I often describe it is that the external me and the internal me were at crosswise purposes. So it wasn't a bad life. It just wasn't my life.
Right.
So I was a successful venture capitalist, worth a lot of money, living a good life. And the better that life became, the worse I felt.
Because the more incongruent it felt.
Yeah. I mean, and it's really confusing because on the one hand, you think, well, you did it. You escaped. You escaped the poverty of your childhood. You escaped the conditions of your childhood. Here you are in a big house in the suburbs. You're doing great, buddy boy. What's there to complain about? And what there was to complain about was it was a brilliant suit of clothes. It just didn't fit me.
Did you have a sense of what's wrong with me? Like, why can't I?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
why
It's
can't
like,
I enjoy this?
trigger warning, I'm about to curse. Like, what the fuck? What's wrong with me that this idealized life that everybody seems to want doesn't satisfy me? There
Right.
must be something broken about me, which I'll say it, behind the good boy patina, behind the facade of my childhood, there was a creeping ever-present belief that I was broken. Because if, for those in the audience who can relate to this, if you grow up with mental illness, and alcoholism is another form of mental illness, if you grow up with mental illness in your family, it can feel like there's just a clock ticking, waiting for your mental illness to show up, waiting for you to become those parents.
Yeah.
And so it's just a matter of time before everybody figures out that you're just screwed up.
I can relate so well. My mom also suffered from mental illness and was suicidal for most of my childhood. And there were super dramatic stories that I can go on someone else's podcast and talk about.
But I just want to pause and just say,
Yeah.
I see you, buddy.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, it might be why I connected with you so well the first time is it's not only the ticking time bomb of when is this going to happen. To me, it's the uncertainty of being in a household where it's not just come home from school and do your homework and watch cartoons. It's something dramatic, really dramatic, could happen at any time, or it could be fine for 2 weeks.
But you still live walking on eggshells. In Reboot, I called it the hypervigilance that you develop. I remember decades later going into my first psychoanalyst office, and yet again, I would punctuate every statement I make with a phrase, "Am I crazy?" Right? You know the feeling. Because the ability to calibrate reality is so undermined. And I remember saying, "All right, Jerry, you're crazy. There, are you satisfied?"
Right. It's like, what's the worst that can happen if you own it?
But there's that consequence of not really understanding reality, or not securely understanding reality.
Well, it seems like this good boy theory is a way to get control.
Absolutely.
It's a path that might obviously not the one that served you ultimately, but it's a way to say, well, nothing was controllable, but I have control over this. And if I'm doing this, maybe there's a subconscious thing that says, well, I can't be crazy if I'm running one of the biggest hedge funds out there and making millions of dollars a year, right?
Right. Yeah. Although then there's the whispery little voice that says, "Aha, so that's what you think."
Yeah.
It's that's right. I mean, this kind of hypervigilance lends itself to creating what I would say is a kind of false self. And the truth is, it wasn't that false. And I'm sure you can relate to this as well. Those parts of us that we developed as adaptations to an intolerable childhood end up serving us well.
Sure.
And they may become the secret to our success. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, like me, you'll probably also develop the hypervigilance, the ability with X-ray vision to sort of figure out what's going on in the room.
Yes.
And be able to respond to that in a different way.
Interesting that's where it came from. I never really thought about that.
What a great survival instinct you developed. And I mean, for me, it served me well first as a reporter, right? And then later as an investor. And then later still as a coach.
I think in business, I mean, I walk into a room and, okay, here's who's got the leverage, here's who doesn't, regardless of position, right? You just look around the room at body language and
That's right.
And that's the wild card over there. And
that's right.
Yep.
That's right. That's right.
I wanted to tell you about something new we've developed here at the Leaders Lab. It's called Team Compass. And here's the best part. It's absolutely free for our clients. We notice a massive gap in how people use behavioral assessments and then manage their people through KPIs. Even progressive companies that use assessments typically make a big mistake. They use them to hire and then they stick them in a drawer and never look at them again. Suddenly, you're managing complex human beings solely through KPIs, and that simply doesn't work. Team Compass is different. We take those behavioral insights with your real world performance feedback and my 30 years of leadership experience to give you concise, actionable feedback that ends the confusion and helps you move your team forward faster. You can lead your team to a path of clarity with Team Compass. To learn more, click the QR code on your screen or the link in our show notes. And now back to the show. So you're having your success on paper, it's looking good. When does it all come to a head again for you? And it sounds like the earlier experience in college, or the big turning point in college, it sounds like it was a bit of a reset, but not necessarily a rebuild, if or a reboot. I mean, to use your word, but like,
That's right.
so second time, how does that come up? Is there a moment that causes that? Is there an incident that causes that?
Yeah. So the depression in my life resurfaced really starting around 2000. And when I trace it back again, part of the catalyst, ironically, was greater and greater success. And, psychologically, probably what was going on was that there was an unconscious um, expectation that the whole thing would blow up. So if you think back to your childhood, Ken, and you know how like 2 weeks would go by and mom was okay, and then all of a sudden the foreboding might start to begin. It's like,
Mm.
oh, when is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? And so um, there was a little bit of that going on. But the real catalyst, if you will, was in 2001. And two things. First was the beginning of the collapse of the, Web 1.0 internet bubble that was going on. But more dramatically was 9/11. And I was already in a process of trying to decide. I knew I could not continue. My then partner, Fred Wilson, and I were in a because of the collapse in internet valuations, our prime backer, JP Morgan, was re-examining what they wanted to do in terms of investing in the internet. And because of my mental state, I knew I couldn't go forward and raise a new fund.
Mm.
So I started thinking about what I wanted to do next. And while that process was underway, 9/11 happened. And 9/11 really rattled me. I lost acquaintances and friends in the attacks. I was down in DC the morning of the attack, and so it felt very, very scary to me. Um, and in the weeks afterwards, I did what I often do, which was I kind of threw myself into work of rebuilding. So I joined the Olympic bid committee. We were trying to bring the 2012 Olympic Games to New York City. I started a fund to help small businesses impacted by the Trade Center attacks. I was doing a lot of activity. And the more activity I did, the less I was paying attention to the underlying anxiety that I was feeling, which was getting worse and worse. I then decided to accept an offer to join JP Morgan as an investor. And so that was around September of that year, just around the date of the attacks. And then by February of 2002, I knew that this was not going to work for me. I was coming into the office and I would cancel every meeting. I would like close the blinds to my office and I would kind of just sit under my desk, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
and not experiencing. I had an assistant then, Carrie, was very sweet. She's still a friend to this day. And she'd look at me look at me in the eyes and she'd say, "Bad day, Jerry?" And I'd say, "Yeah, really bad day." She said, "All right, I'll cancel everything." Um, February 2nd, 2002, I went down to downtown New York to attend a committee meeting, a board meeting for the Olympic Committee. And we were in free space down right near ground zero because nobody wanted to be near ground zero at that point. And I came out of a board meeting and the depression was so overwhelming. I remember going down to the Wall Street subway station and really debating whether or not I was going to jump in front of the train. And I thankfully decided to call my therapist instead. So I got out of the station, called my therapist, Dr. Sayers, and she said, "Get in a cab, come see me right now," because she was out in Great Neck, Long Island. And I did that. And after the conversation with her, I realized that I really needed help, like
Right.
beyond what I was already doing. And I went on a retreat. I experienced meditation for the first time. I started reading books like When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron or Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer, and began a long, slow process of building a life where the outside of me and the inside of me were actually in alignment and no longer at cross purposes. And it was at that moment that the rest of my life really began.
Did you know when you started that process of meditation and self-inquiry, were you aware of the path that you were on, or were you more like, I'm going to try meditation and see how that works, and then I'll try this other thing? And was it more of a stacking?
The best way I could describe that time period goes like this. So the story of the Buddha is, he grows up as a prince, he's protected, and one day he spies an old woman walking outside the castle. And he, in a flash, realizes the truth of birth, old age, sickness, and death. And his life is decimated. And he goes out and he becomes a wandering mendicant in the forest, but he's still not satisfied. And the way I think of it is one day he says, I can't take this anymore. Fuck it. And he sits under the Bodhi tree and he says to himself, I'm not going to move from this spot until I've figured this out. And he wakes up to the Four Noble Truths. That's my interpretation of that story. Well, for me, I interpreted that story that way because that's kind of what happened to me. I just basically said, fuck it. I'm not going to move from this spot. I'm like, forget being an investor. There was no plan. There was nothing. Blaise Pascal once said, all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit alone in a room with his thoughts. And what I did was I sat alone in a room with my thoughts. And it hurt. And it was hard. But if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be alive today.
So while there was no plan, it seems like there was massive commitment. I'm not going to kill myself. I'm not going to go back to investing.
The plan was, I'm going to sit on my ass on a meditation cushion. And that's kind of what I did, whether I was actually sitting in meditation posture or not. That's what I was doing. I was writing. I was journaling. I was attempting to write a novel about a man entering midlife crisis, prompted in part by 9/11. Who was I writing about? I was taking what was going on in therapy and basically doing that across my life. And I was reading, eventually after a year or two, I was talking a lot to people. People were coming to see me to kind of network their way into getting jobs and things like that, because I still had a lot of connections in the startup community. And then eventually I took a course as a coach or training as a coach and realized that that which I was doing to help myself heal was something I could do for a living, which
Yeah.
was to have this kind of conversation all day long.
And then you get to this pivot. You must have been feeling pretty good at that point to go, I'm feeling, or at least grounded at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I think at that point, I would start to make the distinction between, say, happiness and contentment. Because you use the phrase pretty good. Let's dial it down just slightly. I was feeling good enough to be able to say that there's something here for me. There's something vocationally for me. And by the word vocation, I mean the calling aspect. There was something happening where if for an hour I stopped being hypervigilant about my own self and brought my full attention and presence to a client, I would feel better, which was staggering for me and yet at the same time, it's exactly what Buddhism teaches about compassion.
Not only in the way that you write, but the way that you show up. And I'm guessing you were this way in your finance career too. We all have a need for contribution, but I feel like it's higher for some people than others. But I feel like that's at the core of who you are. So it was almost like a necessary step for you to feel whole.
I think you're right. I mean, if you go back to the descriptor I used before, where I said the inner me and the outer me were at cross purposes. Um, what you're experiencing, what you've experienced now, this person, this man, is where the inner me and the outer me are actually together.
Right.
And so I'm showing up, for the most part, exactly how I am internally, consistently. It turns out that's what I needed to do all along.
That was probably the first time in your life you ever felt that way.
That's right. That's
That's
right.
crazy. That's so cool. So where does it go from there?
So I began coaching tentatively. I remember I began coaching actually before I completed the training program that I was in. And I began seeing that I was making a difference. I still had tremendous self-doubt about myself as a coach, as every young coach will. I had numerous supervisors. I went through many different training programs. And I started off maybe coaching a day a week, maybe 2 days a week. And pretty soon, in hindsight, remarkably soon, I was filled with clients. I had a full roster. And full was a moving target. Full used to feel like 5 clients, then it felt like 20 clients, then now it's 40 clients, so it's crazy. But, and then, slowly over time, I realized, no, this is actually who I am on a consistent basis. And, there were baby steps. I rented a small office, then I got a bigger office, then I established, then I joined together with my co-founders, and in 2014 launched Reboot, which really was built off of my individual solo practice into a company. We've now been operating for 11 years. And along the way, I've always been a writer. I mean, it's part of how I make sense of the world. And in 2017, Hollis Heimbach, who is one of the smartest editors in the world, contacted me. I had no idea how important an editor she was. She just emailed me and said, she'd been reading my blog, and she said, "Have you ever considered writing a book?" And we started a conversation, which ended up resulting in a Reboot, which came out in 2019. And writing Reboot felt like my entire life had been this rubber band that was pulled back with this tension. And then finally, I could release it and write the book that I was meant to write. And that book came out in June of 2019. And to this day, I get notes from people saying, this book changed my life. And I don't think that there's any more satisfying feeling for a little boy who tried to make sense of the world by writing stories late into the night in order to make himself feel better. I don't think there's anything more powerful than, I mean, it just happened a few weeks ago. I got this young kid, he's 28 years old. His investor said, you should read this book, because he was going through some really tough times. And he wrote to me about how that book, in fact, impacted him, and it changed the direction of his company. My God, am I lucky.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. You know, most leaders don't build organizations, they build cages, and you can't grow if everything depends on you. Whether you're a founder scaling your company or a corporate leader running a high-performance team, growth starts with people. And that's why the first pillar at the Leaders Lab is building the right team. Before you scale, before you sell, before any big initiative, you need the right leaders around you. Our team has placed over 1,000 executives into Fortune 500 and fast-growing startups and supported over 75 acquisitions along the way, helping leaders create over $1 billion in enterprise value. At the Leaders Lab, we help you hire top talent, scale with confidence, and build a business or team that can thrive without you. Take the free Scale Up scorecard at theleaderslab.co or email me directly, ken@theleaderslab.co, to find out how ready your organization really is for growth. And now, back to the playbook. Reunion comes on the back of COVID. Maybe talk to us about the idea for that book, because it didn't seem like you were looking to write another book. It seemed like the idea kind of happened.
Well, to understand, Reboot's central question is the central question that animated all my therapy and all my own self-exploration. And of course, that's the famous question: how have I been complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want? And it was a very inner exploration, memoir-like book. I tell stories of my clients' lives, and I make these connections. Reunion came about, and you're right, it came about during, let's call it the first summer of COVID, or more specifically, the summer after the murder of George Floyd. And I wrote about my daughter, Emma, in Reboot. And I tell the story of her being 3 years old, 5 years old, 3 years old, and watching me collapse after this horrific experience of overwork. But in the summer of 2020, she was an adult. She is an adult. And there was this other thing going on, which was Emma is a deeply, fiercely committed person, fiercely committed to social justice. And I live in a farm in Colorado, and she lived in New York. She still lives in New York. And one night she was, like a lot of people, protesting the murder of George Floyd. And one night she is with about 5,000 other people, moving from Brooklyn to Manhattan. And she's on the Manhattan Bridge, and she's texting me because there are police on either side of the bridges, Brooklyn and Manhattan side, and they're closing in. And all of a sudden I realized that my daughter is putting her body on the line in the midst of COVID for what she believes to be true about the world, which is that justice is meaningful. And what the fuck am I doing? I'm a straight, white, cis, wealthy man in Colorado who spends a hell of a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to be a better human being. And it forced an internal reckoning, which forced an exploration into the question, how have I been complicit in and benefited from a world I say I don't want to see?
That's a really good question.
Right?
Yeah.
And if I truly am committed to this proposition that better humans make better leaders, or to expand it slightly, better humans are necessary for those of us who hold power. Because if those of us who hold power are not committed to our own development as human beings, we are likely to make the world worse. So I embarked on a process. Reboot was written retrospectively. This is what happened to me. Reunion documents a process of exploration. Who am I? To whom do I belong? What is the reality of my identity? So that I can then open my ears and my eyes to those around me who are being systemically othered, to those around me who don't have the privilege that I have, so that I can actually take the next level of being a better human and stand up for a world that I believe needs to happen. I'll say one more thing. In Reunion, I think it's in chapter 7 or chapter 8, the epigraph I use comes from the Talmud. And in that quote, Rabbi Tarfon says, "It is not up to you to complete the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect the work." And I look at that as a admonishment that even though we are not going to create the world that we want to come into being, right? We live in a world right now where starving children is an acceptable condition. We live in a world where children in high school shoot other children, and somehow this is acceptable. Okay. It is not going to change in my lifetime, but I'll be damned. I'll be damned if I don't try.
I love it. And it's crazy that our kids can teach us about our own ideals, right? Like it's like what you believe in the same thing she believes in, right? Generally.
Absolutely. Well, who do you think gave her those values in the first
Exactly.
place? Her
Yeah.
mom and I.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's just holding up a mirror to us and saying, do you really believe this or not?
Yeah. Do you want to do the work or do you want to talk about it? Right. I mean,
That's it.
I feel like the norm now with leadership is to be complicit and that it's acceptable to be that way if it impacts you. As an example, and maybe I'm idealizing being a child or something, but I feel like when I was growing up, it was, well, leaders do the right thing, even if it's not personally beneficial, right? You'll take the hits for the team because that's what being a leader is. Everybody in government's that way. Donald Trump called Ted Cruz's wife publicly a fat pig, his words.
Right.
And then when it became a necessity for him to get on the bandwagon, he got on the bandwagon after this guy nationally disgraced his wife. And I'm using that as an example. It's common now.
There are a couple of things that we're both bringing attention to. We're talking about hypocrisy. We're talking about a lack of conviction. We're talking about self-aggrandizement, narcissism, grifting, corruption, malevolence against other people. As I say in Reunion, blaming the poor for being poor, as opposed to looking at the system and saying, what the fuck are we doing? I think this is an important distinction. It is really tempting to see these times as the worst of times. And I want to be clear, these are really bad times. Okay, really bad times. And I do not believe that any of the tendencies that we are seeing right now, for example, I think there's a war on empathy, where like the conversation we're having right now, someone might criticize us for being woke or for being weak, some fucking stupid language, right? That is true. But those tendencies are actually part of the human condition and have always been there.
You mean the tendency to squash
Compassion
yeah.
or empathy, the battle that is going on right now. The battle is a never-ending battle.
Why does it seem so in your face? I was listening to Brene Brown the other day, and she was talking about, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but leveraging cruelty as a power move. And she was talking about the ICE raids. She was saying, the current deportation numbers are not like the highest under any president.
No.
There's been administrations that have had higher deportation numbers. What we haven't seen is mass people, dragging screaming kids off their mother's leg in a daycare center.
Well,
now
we haven't
that
seen
seems
it in the United States. We saw it in Nazi Germany.
But that seems to be that cruelty is being leveraged. Like, this is what we're capable of. This is what we can do. And that seems to be more acceptable or mainstream now. You know what I mean?
Let's try to unpack this, okay, for a moment. In a sense, what we're asking is, are these times worse? And the answer is more complicated than the question can convey. You're right. It's more in our faces as white men. Okay. I'm going to say that again. It's more in our faces as white men. Okay. Partially because of the immediacy of technology-enabled media. Okay. When George Floyd died under that police officer's knee, that was not the first time a Black man was killed by a police officer, whether or not he was innocent or whatever. Certainly did not given due process, constitutional right? As the line was at the time, it's just the first time it was filmed, okay? The level of cruelty that we're seeing right now, is it the same as the level of cruelty that the country experienced in the 1950s when Eisenhower ran a program called Operation Wetback? Okay. Or, but did you grow up knowing about that? I didn't.
No, never heard it.
Okay. Or the Palmer raids in the 1920s, or the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 19th century, or slavery, where barbarism and cruelty were the norm, or the use of enslaved people to take land from indigenous people. Okay, we have to confront the fact that barbarism and cruelty have been a part and parcel of this country since its founding. And if you want even more brilliant insight, watch the recent Ken Burns documentary on the American Revolution. It's a more sober analysis. It pulls away the myth of exceptionalism, which I write about in Reunion, because that myth prevents us from seeing the reality. And so, yes, there's a level of cruelty right now that feels unprecedented. And Brene is right. It's being leveraged because it's effective. But this is far from the first time. Ask the people at Stonewall, okay? The reason we celebrate Stonewall is because Stonewall was a tipping point where they said, enough. You're not going to kill us for whom we love.
Right.
Okay. So it is our job to call this out all the time. And what I tried to do in Reunion is try to get to some of the root causes of this. Why do we as a species allow this to happen? And I would argue that it's because we disconnect from the parts of ourselves that are unacceptable. We disconnect from the realities of our ancestors. We move towards the safety of the dominant class. As I explore, how is it that the children and grandchildren of Italian American immigrants who were not considered acceptable in the United States, who were not welcomed in the United States, can turn around and slam the door immigrants from Central and South America?
Blows me away. I don't know. It blows me away.
I mean, all of the people that you're talking about, whether it's Donald Trump or people in administration, they are all children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of immigrants who were not acceptable. And they still came through. So what is it about the underlying psychological condition that allows us to live into that cruelty, or in effect, it's like we have to forget who we were in order for us to be that cruel to one another?
Maybe I'm, being idealistic about past leaders, but I also feel like there's a lack of pushback unlike I've ever seen before. There's less pushback from anyone that I've ever seen before.
How have I been complicit in creating it? How have I been complicit in and benefited from? Don't forget the other half. There's a benefit in staying silent. And if I'm not willing, if I, who have power, am not willing to call out that I have benefited from the system, from systemic oppression, from systemic othering, if I'm not willing to call that out and call it into question and risk my significance, okay, the number of people who've read Reunion pales in comparison to the number of people who've read Reboot. Okay? It's not fun to write a book that doesn't sell as well as the first book you wrote.
Well, I'm guessing the reason it hasn't is where the first book is a book of self-discovery, the second book is calling you out, essentially, right?
Yeah,
I mean, well, if I read this, I might actually have to do something with it. There's a responsibility that goes with the knowledge.
That's right. It's a very uncomfortable book to read.
Yeah.
Because just as it was a really uncomfortable book to write. And what do I owe my daughter, who is now a mother herself? So what do I owe my granddaughter? What is my responsibility? Do I maintain silence because it's more comfortable? This is how cruelty is maintained. That is a relationship you have with your conscience. And as we have all witnessed, okay, look, Ken, you and I have navigated corporate environments for a long time. And if we go back to the Me Too movement, we have all watched men do the bullshit that men can do. And did we call it out? Okay, in those moments. And that's one of the things that I explore. It's like, what were the moments where it was safer for me to say nothing? Okay, and I can either look back with guilt, which is self-lacerating, self-referential, or I can look back with remorse, regret, and a commitment to do differently. And it's the latter that creates forward momentum. So I don't really care if you're standing on the front lines of a protest movement, or if you're just sitting in a dinner party at the holidays and somebody makes a stupid comment. What do you choose to do in that moment? What choices will you make?
I appreciate you, Jerry, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us again. I feel like we're just cracking open a whole nother conversation that could last for many more hours, but really good to see you, man.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for reading the book so closely. It means a lot to me.
That's it for this episode of The Playbook by the Leaders Lab. Thanks for spending some time with us. We'd love it if you would subscribe, share the show, and leave a quick rating and review. Your feedback helps us grow, and it helps more leaders and founders join the conversation. If you'd like to talk more about hiring, scaling, or selling your business, please email me, ken@theleaderslab.co, or connect with me on LinkedIn. We'll be back soon with more strategies you can put to work today. I'm Ken Eslick with Annika Kwacha. Thanks for joining us. Join us again next week in The Playbook.